Welcome everybody to a quick video helping you hopefully understand picking up after class connect session. Now that we're in 1932-33, who is Franklin D. Roosevelt and how is he going to help America with his New Deal program? First, in this video, we're going to take some time and we're going to dive into who is Franklin D. Roosevelt, what was his plan, and what even is the New Deal? So when we talked about in our Class Connect session as we ended, we came to the 1933 election, and we were told, the overwhelming impact that Franklin D. Roosevelt, FDR, is going to win the election. Well, part of that is if you start seeing the reasons for Hoover's ineffectiveness. We do know, just based on Hoovervilles, Hoover Stew, hobos, the different elements, that Hoover was not well liked. He had that hands-off philosophy, hands-off government that his predecessors had continued. He was not really well known for balancing a budget. He didn't kind of believe that it was the government's fault or needed to come in and even help. Eventually, he tried that trickle-down theory where he believed that we could prime the pump, but he ultimately did too little, too late. So in 1932, when we get to the election of Franklin D. Roosevelt, this is the man who is essentially going to come in. FDR in himself was a born politician. He grew up the early time period of the progressive era. He was charismatic. He was an only child to his mother, and his father was much older than his mother. In fact, Delano is where comes from his mother's last name. His mother was 26 younger than his father. He grew up hanging out with his father's friends. He really didn't have a whole lot of friends himself. In fact, his mother was very close to him most of his life. About 14, he was sent on to boarding school. And then as he began to grow up, we started seeing in 1900 he goes to Harvard. So keep in mind what's happening about that Gilded Age. That's when Roosevelt is growing up. Teddy Roosevelt soon becomes his idol. That was a family member of his. He bought the glasses. He wanted to make sure that he was as close to Teddy as he could be. He eventually, in 1906, he's going to marry his wife, also his cousin, a few times removed, Eleanor Roosevelt. They met at a family reunion, and so to speak. Her name actually didn't even change when she married. In fact, it was Eleanor Roosevelt before. Teddy Roosevelt is who gives her away. A little bit about Eleanor Roosevelt. She grew up very far different than Franklin. She grew up mostly being raised by Teddy, who was her uncle. Her upbringing was very rough. She did not have the money that Franklin had growing up. She had much harder life than Franklin. So when they get married, his mother buys them a house right next to hers in New York. And they had 6 children. And then in 1928, he becomes governor of New York. A little bit before that, I want you to keep in mind, as the Roaring Twenties are going on, the war has ended, he actually contracts polio in the summer of 1921. When he contracts polio, you can only imagine, this is a man who has had so many things going for him. His future is extremely bright. And in the blink of an eye, he loses the ability to walk. He loses the feeling from his waist down. Polio was very rampant during this time period. While polio hit him, he tried to hold it in a lot. But basically, Eleanor is going to be the one that becomes his eyes and ears, his feet. She's going to be the one helping promote him, helping get him around. And for a time period, in many of his biographies, it's written how after he contracted the polio, he just shut off from the world. He secluded himself. He moved back to Hyde Park. He tried to, to forget everything. But through his children, through Eleanor, he begins to kind of come back. And by 1928, he begins moving forward. He's governor of New York by 1928. And he begins to kind of move forward. So in 7 years, he has gone from being completely having nothing, broken as can be, to regaining his ability to get back to get into politics, and he is governor of New York City in 1928, roughly at the end of this time period of the Roaring Twenties, right before the stock market crashes. So that's just kind of what we see, but nonetheless, we know in 1932 he wins the presidential election. And he wins it a lot by his idea of his New Deal, if you can recall. He comes in with that idea of the New Deal. Well, actually, in actuality, he didn't have the New Deal actually created at that point in time. But what he knew is that America needed something to hold on to. That was America's faith, especially in the government, was super low at this point in time. So he comes up with a plan. And here's kind of the thinking when people were going for the election. Hoover has no plan, isn't going to help the government. Franklin Roosevelt comes to the scene and says, I have a plan for you. I have my New Deal. We're going to get this passed. So his first 100 days essentially is him coming up with the New Deal. Congress is going to pass more than 15 major New Deal pieces, which we will get into in a different video. It is going to significantly expand the federal government as a whole, including the nation's economy. But one of the biggest elements beyond the New Deal that Franklin Roosevelt does different than any other president at this time is he comes in and he is a part of everybody's lives. As we talked about in the 1920s, radios are a new hot commodity. Everybody has a radio. For the first time, you can not have to be next to someone physically to be next to them. And Franklin Roosevelt did this. He created these fireside chats where he would basically come into the living room of every American who had a radio, and he would tell them what's happening in their country. He would give them plain words that they understood, explain it, walk them through the process. By the time he died, after after 3 full terms and part of a 4th term, when he dies of a hemorrhage in his brain, Americans line up on the train tracks, waiting for their friend to pass as they salute him passing. I say that last piece because it goes to show who he became to Americans, how he brought them out of. He didn't leave them alone. He didn't take the office and then go sit in the White House or walk. He came to them daily. And part of that, in my always thinking, looking into the background of Roosevelt, I do think it's important to understand who he was. Because he understood having something, having that future, and then in a split second losing it all. He had experienced something similar to them. So he was able to relate to them. And he became relatable. He became relatable and charismatic to Americans that gave them that hope that they're going to be okay. As he begins, he's restoring our confidence. Essentially, people are like, well, what are we going to do for the Great Depression? How are we going to get out? The first thing we had to do is believe. He could change everything in the White House, but if people didn't believe, people didn't have confidence, he wasn't going to do anything. So he tried to remind people that we're going to be okay. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. He promised bold leadership, bold action. He wasn't going to be scared to take chances. He was going to get after it. And he asked for divine protection and guidance. So when he proposes this New Deal, the New Deal comes with 3 R's: relief, recovery, reform. And all New Deal programs fall within these 3. I've always explained it like if you're drowning in the middle of the ocean, the first thing that you see is relief. When you see a ship coming, hope is coming on its way, or maybe that ship arrives. Recovery is them throwing that life preserver out to you to pull you onto the boat. Reform is simply them explaining, how is this not going to happen again? And since of the New Deal, relief was putting people in jobs, fixing things that needed to happen. Recovery is putting money in their pocket to give them hope to buy things, to put food on the table. And reform is finding ways so this doesn't happen again. Join me in the next video as we begin to actually dive into what were these New Deal programs and how do they officially begin to help America crawl out of